So in this video, we're going to be looking at this question, examine why there are different baptism practices in the Catholic and Baptist traditions of Christianity, a 10 marker. And we're also just going to, again, go through review how to tackle a 10 marker generally. So obviously what we're aiming for in all of our 10 markers is to be marked at the level 5 level. To do that, we need to make sure our answers are accurate, relevant and fully developed in breadth and depth, that we include very good use of detailed and relevant evidence such as textual references, that we have clear and coherent presentation of ideas and make precise use of subject vocabulary. And we're going to go through each of these steps now. So the first thing I want you to notice about this question is that it's a why question. So examine why there are different baptism practices in the Catholic and Baptist traditions of Christianity. The biggest mistake that students will make with a question like this is that they will almost ignore the why and will just see this as a question about the different baptism practices in those two denominations, and they will literally just blurt out what they know about baptism in the Catholic Church and then baptism in the Baptist Church without really addressing the focus of the question about why there are these differences. So that's the first thing to be alert to. So the key practice that I would like you to consider with a question like this is, before you start writing, aim to come up with 3 points that you can make. So aiming for 3 developed points should help you meet the breadth and depth criteria that we need for a level 5 response, so to score 9 or 10 out of 10. So breadth, 3 different points, 3 different aspects of knowledge that you can use to answer the question is a really good way to show breadth. And only having 3 is a good way to make sure that you are able, in the time allowed, to go into enough depth. So 3, if it doesn't specify 2 specific things in the question, 3 developed points is a really good rule of thumb to follow. So what I've done here is I've come up with 3 different reasons why there are different baptism practices in the Catholic and Baptist traditions. So the ideal would be that you come up with these 3, you think about them before you start to write your answer, and that will help you with the clarity of your response. So the 3 points that I've come up with, and there are others, this is not like an exact science. The 3 points that I've come up with are, firstly, there are different baptism practices in the Catholic and Baptist traditions because they're different denominations. So they're going to approach things in a different way. Secondly, they have different views about what baptism means. And thirdly, they have different views about the significance of baptism. So those are my 3 points, okay, and I would then look to develop those in the body of my answer. So what we're going to aim to do in our answer is include, as well as having the breadth and the depth, we want detailed and relevant evidence of our knowledge. So if we look at each section now in a bit more detail, hopefully you can see how I would aim to do that if I was writing this up fully. So firstly, the first reason I've given as to why there are different baptism practices is that the Catholic and Baptist traditions are different denominations. And then I've gone into, in this first little section, kind of explaining what that means to help explain why that would lead to different baptism practices. So clearly the Catholic tradition sees authority in both church and Bible, whereas as a Protestant denomination, the Baptist tradition places a far greater emphasis on the biblical teaching because of that kind of focus on sola scriptura that stems right back to the Reformation. So the Catholic Church teaches about original sin, remember. This is not something that's like explicitly unpacked fully in the Bible. It's something that the Church has taught based on like key teachings in the Bible, but they've kind of developed it much further, haven't they? So the Catholic Church teaches that original sin needs to be removed through baptism. So there's much more developed theology around baptism, whereas Baptist teaching purely based on the Bible. So it's following the example of Jesus. Jesus was baptized as an adult. Jesus commanded that baptism should happen at the Great Commission. There's a connection in the Bible made between baptism and faith, and so that informs the Baptist response. So my first point then is that the reason there are different baptism practices is related back to the different priorities of those two denominations and where they seek to look for authority. So my second point is that the different views about what baptism means influence these different baptism practices. So in this section, I would talk about or write about how the Catholic tradition sees baptism as a sacrament, an outward sign of an inward grace from God, whereas the Baptist tradition sees baptism as an ordinance, something that's commanded by Jesus at the Great Commission, just before his ascension, where Jesus says, make disciples of all the nations, and commands that they should be baptized as they become disciples. So again, my second point, very clearly addressing the question, a reason why there are different baptism practices stems back to what baptism is essentially believed to be, what it means. So in the Catholic tradition, it's a sacrament, whereas in the Baptist tradition, it's an ordinance. And then my third point that I would develop in my answer would be that the two denominations have different baptism practices because they have different views about the overall significance of baptism. So the Catholic Church teaches that it's important to link each child to Jesus in infancy in order to remove infants' original sin, whereas the Baptist tradition really emphasizes the idea of freely choosing baptism. So as a result, they practice believers' baptism, which includes the giving of a testimony and somebody being really sure that they themselves actually want to be a Christian. So essentially, the different baptism practices, so infant baptism versus believers' baptism, it comes back to how significant baptism is believed to be and the role it's believed to play. So we've talked about breadth and depth, so having the three ideas that can be really fully developed. We've talked about having clear and detailed evidence of your knowledge in relation to the question. The third thing that you need to be really careful about is that your answer is clear and coherent. So the examiner will be looking for you to be presenting your ideas in a really clear way. And the easiest way to do that is literally to just use the phrasing of the question in your work. So you can see here how I would do that. So I would literally have my three sections to show breadth and depth, and I would say the first reason why there are different baptism practices in the Catholic and Baptist traditions of Christianity is that they are two different denominations, meaning that despite sharing many key beliefs, there are key differences in emphasis. And then I would go on and explain my first point. Then I would say in my second paragraph, the second reason why there are different baptism practices in the Catholic and Baptist traditions of Christianity is that the two denominations have different views about what baptism means. And then lastly, the third reason why there are different baptism practices in the Catholic and Baptist traditions of Christianity is that the two denominations have different views about the overall significance of baptism. So this might seem a little repetitive, I don't know, but it makes it so clear. It will make your work so clear if you literally have the first reason, the second reason, the third reason. You're tailoring your response clearly to the question, and you just have to spell it out as clearly as you can for the examiner. Remember, they're looking for your answer to be clear. So make it clear. Use the phrasing from the question in your work. Lastly, let's just talk about precise use of subject vocabulary. So, as I said at the start, there are different reasons that you could give to mine to explain why there are different baptism practices in the Catholic and Baptist traditions. But based on the reasons that I gave, these are some examples of subject vocabulary that I was able to use just in even my plan. So we have denomination, sola scriptura, original sin, sacrament, ordinance, Great Commission, ascension, testimony, full immersion, and then there's atonement, if I was going to be talking about original sin. So one of the key things you could do in revision is actually for each topic, try to make lists of the subject vocabulary that you think you could try to include, anything that's relevant or related. Using these terms effectively is a really good way to showcase your knowledge. And remember, the 10 markers are all about you just showing off what you know. So the more subject-specific vocabulary, the more textual references, the more specific evidence and specific details you can give, the better. So to finish, let's again just remind ourselves what we're looking for in a 10 marker for this question and any 10 marker. Okay, remember, it's literally an assessment purely of your knowledge. Okay, you don't need to be having any kind of conclusion. You don't need to be forming any evaluation. There's no scope for that here. Okay, it's literally just an assessment of your knowledge. So for 9 or 10 marks, you need to make sure that your work is accurate. So that's where effective revision comes in. It's relevant, so you're actually answering the question, and in this case talking about why there are different baptism practices. And as we said at the start, there needs to be an emphasis on breadth and depth. So generally speaking, 3 developed points is a really good way to meet that. Secondly, we're looking for you to use very good use of evidence. So specific evidence, again, that you have revised. The 10 marker is where you can show off how well you have revised. Okay, make sure that you include the relevant evidence, the subject-specific terminology, the key points, the quotes, the reference to scholars, the reference to different denominations. It's all important. And lastly, we need to make sure that your work is clear and coherent, that it makes sense, and that you're presenting ideas in a really clear way. So linking back to the wording of the question not only will help you focus on the question potentially a little bit more, but it will also flag up to the examiner that you are trying to be really clear. And as we've just said, making precise use of subject vocabulary, showing the examiner that you have revised effectively and that you know what keywords and subject specific terms are relevant to this question is really helpful as well.